minutes, we were once again upon the streets of London, bound this time for a residence in Chelsea. The journey was swift, yet fraught with a tension I could not ignore. If two men had already fallen victim to this strange phenomenon, what fate awaited the third? We arrived to find Lestrade waiting at the entrance, his expression more serious than I had ever seen it. "Holmes," he said, "this one's different." "In what way?" Holmes asked. "The man's gone," Lestrade replied. "No body. Just gone." We were conducted inside. The study bore signs of disturbance. Chairs overturned, papers scattered, a sense of abrupt and violent interruption. And there, upon the wall, the portrait. Another woman, another dark attire. But this time, the blackened edge had advanced further than before. Much further. It had reached nearly halfway toward the center. "Extraordinary," Holmes murmured. Lestrade shook his head. "Extraordinary. It's madness. The man disappears, and all you can say is, 'Silence,'" Holmes said sharply. There was something in his tone that halted Lestrade at once. Holmes stepped closer to the painting. "Watson," he said quietly, "do you notice anything unusual?" I looked carefully. At first, I saw only the familiar elements, the figure, the encroaching blackened edge. Then, "Holmes," I said slowly, "the expression." "Yes, it is different." Holmes nodded. "More intense," I said. "More aware." "Precisely." A chill ran through me. "You do not suppose?" "No," Holmes said firmly. "The painting does not change." "Then how do you explain it?" Holmes's gaze remained fixed upon the image. "The change," he said quietly, "is not in the painting." He turned to me. "It is in us." Lestrade gave an exasperated sigh. "There you go again with your riddles." Holmes ignored him. "Tell me," he said, "did anyone see Mr. Hargreaves leave the house?" "No," Lestrade replied. "Servants say he was in his study late last night. This morning, gone. And the door, locked. Window too." Holmes nodded slowly. "A second variation on the theme," he murmured. I felt a growing dread. "Holmes," I said, "what if the effect does not merely kill?" He looked at me. "Yes, what if it does something else?" Holmes held my gaze for a moment. Then, "My dear Watson," he said quietly, "I believe it already has." We left the house soon after, Holmes deep in thought. "Holmes," I said, "you must tell me, what is happening?" He walked in silence for several paces. Then, "The pattern is accelerating," he said. "In what sense?" "Each incident is more advanced than the last," he replied. "More intense, more complete. And the man who disappeared." Holmes's expression was grave. "He may yet be alive," he said. "Maybe." Holmes stopped. "And if he is not?" "Yes." Holmes's voice was low. "Then we are dealing with something far more dangerous than I had first supposed." As we resumed our journey, I could not rid myself of the image of that third portrait, the way the blackened edge had advanced, the unsettling change in expression, the absence of any trace of its owner. And above all, the thought that whatever force lay behind these events was not only continuing, but evolving. If there exists one quality in Sherlock Holmes which I have come to admire above all others, though I confess it has, on occasion, sorely tried my patience, it is his capacity for decisive action at the very moment when matters appear most obscure. Where another man might hesitate, awaiting fuller understanding, Holmes instead advances, guided, as he would say, not by certainty, but by the elimination of impossibility. Thus it was that upon our return from Chelsea, he wasted neither time nor words. "Watson," he said, casting aside his coat and moving directly to the table, "we must act. Tonight." "Tonight," I repeated. "But we have scarcely." "We have more than enough," he interrupted. "The pattern is clear. What remains is to confirm it, and to stop it." I regarded him closely. "You have formed a complete theory, then?" Holmes paused. "I have formed," he said, "a working hypothesis, sufficient to risk an experiment." I could not suppress a slight unease. "An experiment of what nature?" Holmes's eyes met mine. "One in which," he said calmly, "I shall serve as the subject." "Holmes," I exclaimed, "you cannot mean to expose yourself to the same conditions which proved fatal to Mr. Harrow," he said. "Precisely. I cannot allow it." "My dear Watson," he replied, with a faint smile, "you are not in a position to allow or forbid. You are, however, in a position to assist." Before I could protest further, There came a knock at the door, and Inspector Lestrade was shown in once more. "Well, Holmes," he said, "have you made anything of it?" Holmes turned to him at once. "Yes," he said, "and I require your cooperation." Lestrade raised an eyebrow. "That's new." Holmes ignored the remark. "I need the third painting. The one from Chelsea, brought here at once." Lestrade stared at him. "Here, to Baker Street." "Exactly. You must be mad," Lestrade said. "If that thing's dangerous." "It is," Holmes replied. "Which is precisely why we must study it under controlled conditions." Lestrade hesitated. "And if it kills you?" Holmes's lips curved slightly. "Then you will have the satisfaction of being correct." Within 2 hours, the portrait had been delivered. Mrs. Hudson, though outwardly composed, made no attempt to conceal her disapproval of the arrangement, and I confess I shared her sentiments entirely. The painting was placed upon an easel in the center of the room, positioned exactly as Holmes directed, facing the chair in which he now intended to sit. "Holmes," I said quietly, "I must insist, this is reckless in the extreme." "On the contrary," he replied, "it is the only rational course." He turned to Lestrade. "You will remain here," he said, "as will Watson. You will observe, and, if necessary, intervene." "Intervene how?" Lestrade demanded. Holmes's expression grew serious. "If I give the word, or if I fail to respond, you will remove the painting from my line of sight immediately." Lestrade nodded reluctantly. "Very well." Holmes then proceeded to make a number of curious preparations. He adjusted the position of the lamps, altering the angle of illumination in subtle but deliberate ways. He placed a mirror to one side, such that the portrait might be viewed indirectly. He even marked a small position upon the floor. "Watson," he said, "you will stand there." I did so. "And you, Inspector, there." Lestrade complied. Holmes took his seat. "Now," he said, "we begin." A silence fell. Holmes fixed his gaze upon the portrait. At first, nothing occurred. The room was utterly still, save for the faint ticking of the clock upon the mantel. Minutes passed. Then, "Observe the edge," Holmes said softly. I looked. The blackened border, already advanced, seemed to darken further. "It is beginning," I said. Holmes did not reply. His gaze remained steady. What followed was a most extraordinary, and, I must confess, deeply disturbing, sequence of events. Holmes's posture did not change, yet there was a subtle shift in his expression. His features grew more intent, more focused, as though he were following something invisible to the rest of us. "Holmes," I said quietly. No response. "Do not interrupt," he said at last, his voice distant. I fell silent. The blackened edge crept inward. Slowly, relentlessly, and as it did, I became aware of a most peculiar sensation. It was as though the room itself had altered. The light seemed dimmer, the air heavier, even the sound of the clock grew faint, as though receding. "Holmes," I said again, unable to restrain myself. His voice came, low and strained. "I see it." "See what?" "The pattern," he said. "The structure, the path it compels the eye to follow." Lestrade shifted uneasily. "I don't like this," he muttered. Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Extraordinary," he murmured. "It is not the image. It is the sequence, the progression of perception." His hand gripped the arm of the chair. "And at the center," his voice faltered. "Yes," I urged. Holmes's eyes widened, just slightly. "A contradiction," he said. At that instant, something changed. I cannot describe it precisely, but I felt it. A sudden, sharp tension in the air. Holmes stiffened. "Holmes," I cried. His voice, when it came, was strained. "Watson, the mind attempts to resolve it, but it cannot." His breathing quickened. "The image, it leads to an impossibility." "Lestrade," I shouted. "The painting." But Holmes raised a hand. "No," I hesitated. "Not yet," he said. "I must see." His voice broke. For a moment, I feared. Then, he blinked. Once, twice, and suddenly, the tension broke. The room seemed to return to itself. The light steadied. The sound of the clock resumed its normal rhythm. Holmes sagged back in his chair, pale but composed. "It is as I thought," he said quietly. I rushed to his side. "Holmes, are you hurt?" "No," he said, "only enlightened." Lestrade exhaled sharply. "You nearly gave us both a heart attack," he said. Holmes gave a faint smile. My apologies. He rose slowly and turned to the portrait. Destroy it, Lestrade said at once. We've seen enough. Holmes shook his head. Not yet. Lestrade groaned. What more do you need? Holmes's gaze was fixed upon the image. I looked at him intently. Then explain, I said. Holmes turned to us both. These paintings, he said, are not merely works of art. We've established that, Lestrade muttered. They are constructs, Holmes continued, designed to guide the observer's perception along a precise path, one which culminates in a contradiction. A contradiction, I repeated. Yes, Holmes said, a visual paradox, subtle at first, but increasingly pronounced as the eye follows the pattern. And what happens then? I asked. Holmes's expression grew grave. The mind, he said, attempts to resolve what it sees. And if it cannot, Holmes met my gaze. Then it fails. A silence fell. Lestrade shook his head. You're saying a man can die just by looking at a picture? Holmes's voice was calm. I am saying, he replied, that under certain conditions, the human mind may be driven beyond its capacity to reconcile perception with reality. And the burning? I asked. Holmes turned to the portrait once more. A secondary effect, he said. A visual manifestation of the same process, perceived, not actual. I felt a chill. And the man who disappeared? Holmes was silent for a moment. Then, that, he said, as the final piece. He moved toward the table, his eyes alight once more with that familiar, formidable brilliance. We are close now, he said. Very close. And as I looked at him, pale, exhausted, yet driven by that relentless intellect, I could not help but feel that we stood upon the brink of revelation. Yet one question remained, perhaps the most troubling of all. If the mind could be driven to destruction by what it perceived, then what, I wondered, lay at the very center of that terrible pattern? There are moments in the career of Sherlock Holmes when his actions, though seemingly abrupt, reveal themselves upon closer inspection to be the inevitable culmination of a chain of reasoning so precise that no other course would suffice. Such a moment now presented itself. Holmes did not sleep that night. Nor, I believe, did I. The events I had witnessed, the strange experiment, the visible strain upon Holmes's faculties, and the chilling explanation he had offered, had left my mind in a state of restless agitation. Again and again, I found myself recalling his words. A contradiction, one the mind cannot resolve. What form could such a contradiction take? And how could it possess the power to unmake a man's reason, or his very life? At dawn, I found Holmes seated at the table, surrounded by his notes, the diagrams from Varelli's studio, and several fresh sketches of his own. His face was pale, but his eyes shone with a fierce and unmistakable clarity. You have not slept, I said. Sleep is a concession to ignorance, he replied lightly. And I find myself, at present, intolerant of such concessions. I smiled faintly, though I could not share his composure. You have reached a conclusion, then. Holmes folded his hands. I have reached, he said, a point at which further speculation would be unproductive. It is time to act. By mid-morning, Holmes had dispatched a series of telegrams. Inspector Lestrade was summoned, along with Mr. Arthur Llewellyn, the first of our clients, and several individuals connected, directly or indirectly, to the acquisition and distribution of the paintings. Even Silas Breckenridge, the reluctant dealer, was compelled to attend. When all had assembled in our sitting room at Baker Street, the atmosphere was one of palpable tension. Llewellyn sat near the fireplace, his expression anxious but hopeful. Lestrade stood with arms folded, his skepticism undiminished. Breckenridge hovered near the door, casting nervous glances about the room. Holmes, meanwhile, stood at the center, calm, composed, and utterly in command. Gentlemen, he began, I thank you for attending. The matter which brings us together is, as you are aware, of no ordinary nature. Lestrade gave a short laugh. That's one way of putting it. Holmes inclined his head. I shall endeavor, he continued, to present the facts with clarity. He moved to the table, upon which he had arranged several sketches and notes. We are dealing, he said, with a series of paintings produced by one E. Varelli, a man whose understanding of visual perception was, by all accounts, exceptional. Or unhinged, Lestrade muttered. Holmes did not disagree. Possibly both, he said. He picked up one of the diagrams. These works are not mere representations. They are constructions, designed to guide the observer's eye along a predetermined path. Yes, yes, Lestrade said. You've said as much, but how does that explain the deaths? Holmes looked at him steadily. Because, he said, the path leads somewhere. A silence fell. Where? I asked. Holmes turned to me. To a contradiction, he said. He lifted one of his sketches and held it up. Imagine, he continued, that the eye is guided, step by step, through a sequence of visual cues. Each element reinforces the next, drawing the observer deeper into the structure of the image. He paused, and at the center of that structure lies an impossibility. Llewellyn leaned forward. An impossibility, yes, Holmes said. A form, subtle, concealed, yet fundamentally irreconcilable with the laws by which the mind interprets space, perspective, and motion. Breckenridge shifted uneasily. You're saying the painting tricks the brain? Holmes shook his head. Not merely tricks, he said. It compels. I felt a growing unease. And when the mind reaches this impossibility? I asked. Holmes's expression grew grave. It attempts to resolve it, he said. As it must. But the structure permits no resolution. And then, Holmes met my gaze. The process intensifies. Lestrade frowned. Intensifies how? Holmes's voice was quiet. The mind becomes trapped in a loop, repeating the same attempt, over and over, each time failing to reconcile what it perceives. Llewellyn swallowed. And that kills a man. In extreme cases, Holmes said, yes. A silence followed, heavy, oppressive. I broke it. And the burning? I asked. The blackened edge. Holmes nodded. A secondary phenomenon, he said. A visual manifestation of the same process. The observer perceives decay, destruction, though no physical change occurs. Lestrade snorted. You expect us to believe that the canvas isn't actually burning? Holmes's eyes flicked toward him. I expect you to observe, he said, that there is no heat, no residue, no physical evidence of combustion. Lestrade hesitated. That's true enough, he admitted. Holmes set down the sketch. Now, he said, we come to the most important point. He turned to Llewellyn. You, sir, survived. Llewellyn nodded nervously. Yes. Why? Holmes asked. I do not know. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Because, he said, you did not complete the sequence. I felt a sudden clarity. You mean? He looked away. Precisely, Holmes said, before the mind could reach the central contradiction. Llewellyn shuddered. Then Mr. Harrow did not. Holmes finished. Lestrade shifted his weight. And the missing man. Holmes was silent for a moment. Then, his case, he said slowly, suggests a variation. In what sense? I asked. Holmes's expression grew more intense. What if, he said, the mind does not collapse, but adapts? A murmur passed through the room. Adapts, Lestrade repeated. Holmes nodded. To the contradiction, he said. To the impossible. That's nonsense, Lestrade said. Is it? Holmes replied calmly. He turned to the portrait, which still stood upon the easel. Consider, he said, that perception defines reality, for the observer. If that perception is altered, he let the thought hang. You mean the man might still be alive? I asked. Holmes looked at me. Yes, he said. But, where? Holmes's gaze returned to the painting. That, he said quietly, as the final question. A silence fell. Then, suddenly, Breckenridge spoke. There was something, he said hesitantly. Holmes turned at once. Yes, at the house, Breckenridge said. The one in Kensington. When I cleared it out, there was a room in the back. Holmes stepped closer. Go on. It was locked, Breckenridge said. I forced it open, and there was a painting inside, he said. Different from the others, not finished. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Describe it. Breckenridge swallowed. It wasn't a portrait, he said. Not exactly. More like a shape. Hard to look at. Didn't make sense. Holmes's voice was low. A central form. Yes, Breckenridge said. That's it. Holmes straightened. Gentlemen, he said, we have reached the heart of the matter. Lestrade frowned. You mean to say the answer's in that house? Holmes nodded. In that room, he said. And in that final work. I felt a surge of anticipation and dread. You intend to return there? Immediately, Holmes replied. As the others prepared to depart, I drew closer to him. Holmes, I said quietly, what do you expect to find? He paused. Then, the source, he said. And the missing man. Holmes's expression was unreadable. If he lives, he said, we shall find him. And if he does not? Holmes's gaze hardened. Then we shall find the reason. And so it was that we set out once more for the abandoned house in Kensington, now no longer merely a place of origin, but the focal point of all that had transpired. Yet even as we went, one thought pressed upon my mind with increasing force. If Varelli had indeed created a final work, one containing the full expression of his terrible design, then what awaited us there might prove more dangerous than anything we had yet encountered. It was nearing dusk when we once again approached the deserted residence in Kensington, the former abode of the late E. Varelli. The fading light lent the structure an even more desolate aspect than before, its darkened windows staring out like vacant eyes, its silence heavy with the suggestion of secrets long undisturbed. Our party was smaller now. Holmes, myself, Inspector Lestrade, and the unwilling yet necessary Silas Breckenridge stood before the iron gate. Mr. Llewellyn had declined to accompany us, pleading a state of nerves which I could not in good conscience dispute. You're certain about this? Lestrade muttered, glancing uneasily at the house. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied the building with that intense, penetrating gaze of his, as though attempting to read, in its very structure, the intentions of the man who had once inhabited it. At the heart of every design, he said at last, there is a point of convergence. If Varelli pursued his experiments to their conclusion, it is here that we shall find it. Lestrade gave a low grunt. Let's hope we don't find more than we bargained for. We entered as before, our footsteps echoing faint on a bitterly cold evening in January, one of those London nights when the frost clings stubbornly to the window panes and the fog hangs low like a suffocating veil, that I first became aware of the singular case which I have since come to regard as the secret of the burning portrait. Sherlock Holmes had spent the greater part of that day in one of his more introspective humors. He lay stretched upon the settee, his long frame motionless, his eyes half closed, as though in repose. Yet I, who knew him well, understood that beneath that still exterior his mind was engaged in the most rapid and intricate processes. Before him, upon the small table, lay a curious assortment of objects, a length of twine, a charred scrap of paper, and a small glass vial containing what appeared to be a residue of ash. You perceive, Watson, he said at last, without opening his eyes, that the combustion was neither accidental nor complete. I lowered my medical journal and regarded him with interest. I perceive nothing of the sort, I replied. Indeed, I perceive only that you have been conducting experiments of a most dubious nature upon the sitting-room table. Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile. And yet, if you were to observe more closely, you would note that the ash retains structure, an impossibility in ordinary flame. I rose and examined the fragment. He was correct. The delicate outline of what had once been paper remained intact, though reduced to a fragile, blackened shell. Curious, I murmured. Highly so, Holmes replied. It suggests a form of heat which consumes without disturbance, a most elegant process. Before I could inquire further, there came a sharp knock at the door below, urgent, almost frantic in its insistence. Mrs. Hudson's voice followed, raised slightly in protest, and then hurried footsteps upon the stairs. The door flew open. The gentleman who entered was in a state of such visible agitation that I sprang to my feet at once. He was of middle height, well dressed though disheveled, his face pale and drawn, his breath coming in quick, uneven bursts. Mr. Holmes, he cried, you must help me. There is no one else, no one who will believe what I have seen. Holmes rose slowly, his languor vanishing in an instant. Pray compose yourself, sir, he said. You are among friends. Sit, and tell us what has occurred. The man sank into the nearest chair, pressing a trembling hand to his brow. My name is Arthur Llewellyn, he said. I am a collector, of art, primarily. Portraits, in particular. Holmes inclined his head. A refined pursuit. It was, the man said hoarsely. Until 3 nights ago. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Go on. Llewellyn swallowed. I acquired a painting, he said. A portrait of a woman. It was unusual, striking, certainly, but there was something else about it. Something I could not quite define. Where did you obtain it? I asked. At a private sale. The provenance was unclear. But the price was modest, and I thought little of it at the time. Holmes moved closer, his attention fully engaged. And what occurred? Llewellyn's voice dropped. The first night, nothing. I placed it in my study and retired. But the following evening, I noticed a faint smell. Smoke, Holmes suggested. Yes, but there was no fire. None at all. Holmes's gaze flicked briefly toward the charred fragment upon the table. Continue. I approached the painting, Llewellyn said, his hands tightening upon his knees, and I saw it. Saw what? The edges of the canvas, he whispered. They were blackened, as though scorched. Yet there was no flame, no heat. Only that smell, and the slow, creeping mark of burning. A silence fell upon the room. And the painting? Holmes asked. It remains, said Llewellyn. But each night, it changes. In what manner? The burning spreads, he said. Always in the same pattern. Always from the edges inward. Yet the image itself, the woman, it remains untouched. Holmes's expression grew intensely thoughtful. Most remarkable. There is more, Llewellyn added, his voice trembling. Last night, I thought I saw her move. I felt a distinct chill. Move, I repeated. Yes, not the canvas, not the frame, but the figure within it. Her eyes, I could swear they shifted. Holmes did not dismiss the statement, as another man might have done. Instead, he regarded Llewellyn with the utmost seriousness. And you have brought nothing with you? He asked. Llewellyn shook his head. I dared not move it, he said. I feared, God help me, I feared it might worsen. Holmes turned to me. Watson, your coat. You intend to go at once? I asked. Without delay, he replied. A phenomenon which progresses nightly affords us little time for hesitation. He turned back to Llewellyn. You will take us to this painting. The man rose at once, relief flooding his features. Yes, of course. As we descended the stairs and stepped out into the cold, fog-laden street, I could not help but reflect upon the curious convergence of events. The charred fragment upon our table, Holmes's earlier remarks upon unnatural combustion, and now this tale of a portrait that burned without flame. Holmes, I said quietly, as we entered the waiting hansom cab, you do not suppose there is some natural explanation for this? Holmes settled himself opposite me, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. My dear Watson, he said, there is always a natural explanation. Even for a painting that burns without fire. Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly in the dim light. Especially for that, he replied. The cab lurched forward, carrying us through the winding streets of London toward a mystery which, even then, I sensed would prove as intricate as any we had yet encountered. And as the fog closed in around us, I found myself wondering. What manner of secret could reside within a simple portrait, that it should consume itself, night by night, without so much as a single flame? It has ever been a source of quiet amusement to me that Sherlock Holmes, when confronted with a mystery of the most extraordinary character, will often begin not with the case itself, but with some seemingly trivial demonstration, one designed less to instruct than to remind his companion, in this instance, myself, of the vast gulf which separates observation from mere sight. Such was precisely the case on the evening we accompanied Mr. Arthur Llewellyn to his residence. Before our departure from Baker Street, Holmes paused abruptly at the threshold and turned back into the sitting room. One moment, Watson, he said. There is a small matter which I should like to clarify. He crossed swiftly to the table, where the charred fragment of paper still lay, and beckoned me nearer. You observed this earlier, he said. I did, and you remarked upon its curious preservation of form. Indeed. Holmes took up the fragment with delicate care and held it toward the light. Now tell me, he continued, what do you deduce from the manner of its destruction? I examined it closely, though I confess my conclusions were tentative at best. The combustion appears uniform, I said. There is no tearing, no distortion. It suggests a steady, even application of heat. Holmes nodded. Good. And yet, what is absent? I hesitated. Flame, I ventured. Precisely, said Holmes. There is no evidence of open flame. No curling at the edges, no irregular charring. The process is controlled. He replaced the fragment upon the table. Remember that, Watson, he added. It may prove of importance. With that, he seized his coat and hat, and we descended once more to the street, where Mr. Llewellyn waited in a state of barely contained agitation. The journey to our client's residence took us through the quieter districts of London, where the streets, though less crowded, seemed no less shrouded in that pervasive winter gloom. The gas lamps burned low, their light diffused into halos by the ever-present mist, and the sound of our cab's passage echoed strangely in the stillness. Mr. Llewellyn spoke little during the drive, though I observed that his gaze drifted repeatedly toward the window, as though half expecting to see something, or someone, following our progress. Holmes, on the other hand, remained silent, his eyes closed, his expression one of intense inward concentration. At length, the cab drew to a halt before a handsome townhouse of 3 stories, its facade well kept and its windows brightly lit. "This is my residence," said Llewellyn, his voice betraying a slight tremor. "The study is at the rear." Holmes alighted at once. "Lead on," he said. We were conducted through a narrow hallway and into a spacious study, richly furnished and lined with paintings of various sizes and styles. It was immediately evident that Mr. Llewellyn was a man of considerable taste, and, I suspected, of equally considerable means. Yet it was not the room itself which commanded our attention. It was the portrait. It hung upon the far wall, framed in dark wood, illuminated by a single lamp placed deliberately before it. Even at a distance, I could perceive that something was amiss. "Good heavens," I murmured. Holmes stepped forward, his gaze fixed. "Just so," he said quietly. The painting depicted a woman of striking beauty, her features composed, her expression enigmatic. She was dressed in black, her dark hair drawn back, her eyes directed outward with an intensity that was almost disconcerting. But it was not the subject which held our attention. It was the canvas itself. Along its edges, a thin, blackened border had formed, as though the very fabric had been scorched. The discoloration crept inward in delicate, branching patterns, yet the central image remained untouched, vivid and intact. "There," said Llewellyn, his voice barely above a whisper. "You see it." Holmes approached until he stood but inches from the frame. "Yes," he said, "I see it." He extended a hand, but did not touch the surface. Instead, he held his fingers just short of the canvas, as though testing for heat. "Nothing," he murmured. "No warmth whatsoever." "Exactly," cried Llewellyn. "And yet it burns, night after night." Holmes turned slightly. "Tell me, Mr. Llewellyn, at what hour does the change occur?" "Always after midnight," he replied. "Never before. And you have observed it directly?" "Yes, though I confess," he hesitated, "I find it increasingly difficult to do so." "Why is that?" Llewellyn swallowed. "There is something about it. The longer one looks, the more unsettled one becomes." Holmes's eyes flickered with interest. "Unsettled in what way?" "It is difficult to describe," he said. "A sense that something is not as it should be. That the image is aware." I felt a slight tightening in my chest. "Surely that is imagination," I said. "Perhaps," Llewellyn replied weakly. "I hope so." Holmes said nothing. Instead, he began a slow, methodical examination of the room. He inspected the walls, the floor, the position of the lamps, even the arrangement of the other paintings. He paused before each in turn, as though comparing them silently to the one in question. "Watson," he said at last, "what do you observe?" I glanced about. "The other paintings are unaffected," I said. "There is no similar damage." "Precisely," Holmes replied, "which suggests that the phenomenon is not environmental." He moved closer to the portrait once more. "And yet it is consistent," he continued. "Localized, progressive." He turned to Llewellyn. "You have made no attempt to remove it?" "None," said the man quickly. "I feared that it might accelerate the process," Holmes finished. "Yes." Holmes nodded slowly, a reasonable concern. It was at this moment that he performed one of those small yet extraordinary demonstrations which I have so often attempted, vainly, to emulate. "Watson," he said, "your pocket mirror, if you please." I produced it at once, and he took it with a brief nod of thanks. Holding it at an angle, he positioned himself so that the portrait was visible not directly, but in reflection. "Observe," he said. I stepped beside him and looked into the mirror. For a moment, I saw only the image as before, the woman, the dark attire, the encroaching blackened edges. Then, "Holmes," I exclaimed, "what is it?" "The pattern, it appears different." Holmes's lips curved faintly. "Just so. What does it mean?" I asked. "It means," he said quietly, that what we are observing may not be a simple physical process, but one dependent upon perception itself. Mr. Llewellyn stared at him. You cannot mean. I mean nothing as yet, Holmes interrupted. Only that we must proceed with care. He lowered the mirror and returned it to me. We shall remain here tonight, he said, and observe the phenomenon at the hour of its occurrence. Llewellyn looked both relieved and apprehensive. As you wish, he said. And so it was that we settled ourselves in that dimly lit study, the portrait before us, the hours stretching slowly toward midnight. Holmes sat in silence, his gaze fixed, not always upon the painting itself, but often upon its surroundings, as though seeking some hidden relation between object and environment. For my own part, I found it increasingly difficult to look at the portrait for any length of time. There was, as our client had suggested, something profoundly disquieting in its presence. The woman's eyes. I cannot say precisely what troubled me about them. Only that I felt, most strongly, that they were not entirely passive. And as the clock upon the mantel began to chime the quarter hour before midnight, a curious sensation came over me. A sense that we stood upon the brink of something most unnatural. The room fell utterly silent. The final minutes ticked away. And then, the clock struck 12. Holmes leaned forward. Now, he said softly. I fixed my gaze upon the portrait. At first, nothing occurred. Then, a faint, almost imperceptible darkening along the edge. It spread, slowly, silently, without flame, without heat. The canvas was burning, and yet, he folded his arms. You sold a painting to Mr. Llewellyn. So I sell paintings. That's my business. Holmes leaned forward slightly. The portrait of a woman, he said. Signed E. Varelli. At the mention of the name, Breckenridge's expression altered, very slightly, but enough. Never heard of him, he said quickly. Holmes smiled faintly. A curious response, he said. Particularly from a man who deals in art. I deal in what sells, Breckenridge snapped. Names don't matter. Holmes's gaze remained steady. And yet this particular painting, you parted with it readily. Good price, he said. That's all. Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then, where did you obtain it? He asked. Breckenridge hesitated. Estate sale, he said at last. Old house. Contents auctioned off. Address. I don't recall. Holmes's smile did not waver. My dear sir, he said softly, you recall perfectly well. A silence fell. Breckenridge shifted in his chair. Why should I tell you anything? He muttered. Holmes's voice remained calm. Because, he said, if you do not, I shall be forced to conclude that you are withholding information relevant to a matter of considerable seriousness. Lestrade stepped forward. And that, he added, could be very inconvenient for you. Breckenridge's composure wavered. All right, he said suddenly. All right, I'll tell you. Holmes inclined his head. I am listening. It was a house in Kensington, Breckenridge said. Belonged to a foreign gentleman, Italian, I think. Died suddenly. No family. Everything sold off. Holmes's eyes sharpened. The name. Breckenridge swallowed. Varelli, he said. A silence followed, heavy with implication. Holmes rose slowly. Thank you, he said. Breckenridge looked at him uneasily. That's all, then, for now, Holmes replied. As we stepped back into the street, I turned to Holmes at once. Well, I said, what do you make of it? Holmes drew his coat more tightly about him. I make of it, he said, that we have found our first suspect. You believe this Varelli is responsible? Holmes glanced at me. I believe, he said, that he is at the very least, connected. And Breckenridge, Holmes's lips curved slightly, a man of opportunity, he said. But not, I think, of invention. I frowned. Then the matter is not so simple as it appears. Holmes gave a soft laugh. My dear Watson, he said, if it were simple, I should not be involved. And as we turned our steps toward Kensington, to the house of the dead painter, I could not shake the feeling that we had only just begun to uncover the truth. For if the creator of the portrait lay already in his grave, then what force, I wondered, continued his work? If there is one habit of Sherlock Holmes which has, over the years, alternately enlightened and exasperated me, it is his tendency, when upon the brink of some crucial discovery, to retreat into a silence so complete that even the most direct inquiry fails to penetrate it. I have long since learned that such moments are not born of uncertainty, but of concentration so intense that all outward communication becomes, for a time, superfluous. Such was his condition as we made our way to Kensington. The address provided by Breckenridge led us to a once elegant residence now fallen into neglect. The iron gate hung slightly ajar, and the garden beyond had grown wild, its paths obscured by encroaching weeds. The house itself stood in somber silence, its windows dark, its facade bearing the unmistakable marks of abandonment. This, I remarked, must have been the residence of Varelli. Holmes gave a slight nod. Indeed, and, I suspect, the origin of our mystery. Lestrade, who had accompanied us thus far, glanced about with visible impatience. Well, he said, if there's anything to be found, we'd best find it quickly. I've little patience for empty houses. Holmes cast him a sidelong glance. My dear Inspector, empty houses are rarely as empty as they appear. The door yielded easily to a firm push, and we entered into a narrow hallway thick with dust and the stale odor of long confinement. Our footsteps echoed faintly, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the stillness. Careful where you tread, Holmes said. Disturb as little as possible. We proceeded into what had evidently been the main studio. The sight that met us there was one I shall not soon forget. The room was vast, its high ceiling supported by dark wooden beams. Tall windows, now dimmed by grime, admitted a weak and uncertain light. Scattered about the space were canvases, some finished, others abandoned midway, along with easels, brushes, and the various instruments of an artist's trade. Yet there was something else. A sense, subtle, yet unmistakable, that the room had been left not in haste, but in interruption. As though its occupant had been engaged in work of importance, and had not returned to complete it. Holmes moved at once to the nearest canvas. Watson, he said, observe. I joined him. The painting depicted a landscape, dark, brooding, yet skillfully rendered. There was nothing, at first glance, to distinguish it from any other work of its kind. Nothing unusual, I said. Holmes said nothing. Instead, he shifted his position slightly, viewing the canvas from a different angle. Now, he said. I followed his example. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, good heavens, I murmured. The image seemed to alter, subtly, but undeniably. The shadows deepened. The perspective shifted in a way that I could not entirely account for. You perceive it? Holmes asked. Yes, but how? Light, he said simply. Angle, reflection. He stepped back. Varelli was no ordinary painter, Watson. He understood not merely color and form, but perception itself. Lestrade snorted. Or he knew how to paint a trick picture, he said. I've seen fairground artists do the same. Holmes did not argue. Quite so, he said mildly. And yet, I wonder whether this is merely a trick, or something more deliberate. We continued our examination. Several of the canvases bore similar characteristics, subtle distortions that revealed themselves only under certain conditions of light and position. Others appeared entirely ordinary. At length, Holmes came upon a work which caused him to pause. It was a portrait, not the same as the one in Mr. Llewellyn's possession, but similar in style. A woman, dressed in dark attire, her expression composed, her eyes fixed upon the viewer. Holmes leaned closer. Another, he murmured. I felt a slight tightening in my chest. The same subject? I asked. Not identical, he replied. But closely related. He examined the lower corner. No signature, he said. Curious. Lestrade folded his arms. So the fellow painted women, he said. That's hardly a crime. Holmes's gaze remained upon the canvas. No, he said quietly. But what he did with them may be. It was then that Holmes noticed something which, I confess, had entirely escaped my attention. Watson, he said sharply, the surface. I leaned in. What of it? Look closely, he said. I did so. At first, I saw only the smooth texture of the paint. Then, a faint pattern, so faint that it might easily have been overlooked. Lines, I said slowly. Very fine. Almost like etching. Holmes nodded. Precisely. He withdrew his lens and examined the surface in greater detail. These are not brushstrokes, he said. They are deliberate markings. Structured. For what purpose? I asked. Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he straightened and stepped back, his expression growing increasingly intent. Watson, he said at last, What if the painting is not merely an image, but a device? I stared at him. A device? Yes. Something constructed to produce an effect upon the observer. Effect how? Holmes's gaze shifted briefly toward the portrait's eyes. That, he said quietly, is what we must determine. Lestrade, who had been examining the far side of the room, called out suddenly. Holmes, over here. We joined him at once. He stood before a large worktable, upon which lay a number of scattered papers, sketches, notes, and what appeared to be diagrams. Holmes's interest was immediate. Do not touch anything, he said, though Lestrade had already begun to shuffle through the papers. Looks like gibberish to me, the inspector said. Angles, lines, numbers, nothing of use. Holmes gently took the papers from him. On the contrary, he said, this is of the greatest use. He spread them out upon the table, his eyes scanning them rapidly. What is it? I asked. Studies, he said. Experiments in visual structure, how the eye interprets form and movement. He paused. And here, he tapped a particular diagram. Watson, do you see this? I leaned closer. It was a series of concentric shapes, intersected by fine lines, arranged in a pattern that was strangely difficult to focus upon. Yes, I said, but I do not understand it. Holmes's voice was low. It is designed, he said, to guide the eye along a specific path, and to control what it perceives. A chill ran through me. You mean, the viewer is being directed? Exactly. To what end? Holmes's gaze hardened. To create an effect. He gathered the papers carefully. This, he said, is the key. Lestrade looked unimpressed. Looks like the scribblings of a madman to me. Holmes smiled faintly. Madness and genius, Inspector, are often separated by the thinnest of lines. As we prepared to leave, I could not help but glance once more at the unfinished portrait upon the easel. For a fleeting instant, I thought, no, it was impossible, and yet, I could have sworn that the expression had altered. Only slightly, only for a moment. I said nothing. Back in the street, I turned to Holmes. Well, I said, you have discovered something. Holmes was silent for a moment. Then he said, yes, and you will tell me. He glanced at me, and there was that familiar look in his eyes. The look that told me he knew more than he was willing to reveal. Not yet, Watson, he said. I felt a flicker of irritation. Holmes, all in good time, he interrupted gently. But surely, consider, he said, what we have learned. A painter who understood perception, I said. A series of works designed to influence the viewer. And a portrait that appears to burn without flame. Holmes nodded. Just so. And you have formed a theory. Holmes's lips curved faintly. I have formed, he said, the beginnings of one. He turned away. Come, Watson, we have much to do. As we made our way back through the fog-laden streets, I could not rid myself of a most troubling thought. Holmes knew something he had chosen, deliberately, to conceal. And in all my years with him, I had learned that when he withheld a detail, it was never without reason. It is a peculiarity of certain cases that just as the mind begins to form a coherent theory, however incomplete, events conspire to disturb that fragile structure and force one to reconsider every prior assumption. Such was. A chill ran through me as I realized that whatever force lay behind this phenomenon, it had only just begun to reveal itself. I have often found that the true genius of Sherlock Holmes lies not merely in his ability to observe, but in his remarkable patience at the moment when others are most inclined to act. While Mr. Llewellyn paced the room in evident distress, and I myself struggled to reconcile what I had witnessed with any known principle of science, Holmes remained perfectly still, his keen gray eyes fixed upon the portrait as the strange, silent, burning, continued its deliberate advance. Do not move, he said quietly. There was something in his tone, firm, almost commanding, that compelled obedience. We stood as we were. The blackened edge crept inward another fraction of an inch. It did not crackle, nor did it distort the canvas in the manner of ordinary flame. It simply advanced. Holmes rose slowly from his chair. Watson, he said, come here, but not directly. Approach from the side. I did as instructed, though I confess I felt an inexplicable reluctance to draw nearer to the thing. Now, Holmes continued, observe the boundary. I leaned closer, careful not to touch the canvas. The line between the unaffected portion and the blackened edge was astonishingly precise, Too precise, I thought, for any natural process. It is as though it has been drawn, I murmured. Holmes nodded. Exactly. A defined progression. Not random combustion. Mr. Llewellyn gave a nervous laugh. You speak of it as though it were deliberate. Holmes did not look at him. My dear sir, he said, everything that occurs follows a pattern. Our task is merely to discover it. The burning ceased as abruptly as it had begun. One moment it advanced. The next, it halted, leaving behind a slightly larger ring of charred canvas than before. A silence followed. Holmes straightened. Midnight to midnight plus 3 minutes, he said. A fixed interval. You mean it only burns for that short time? I asked. So it would appear. Llewellyn ran a hand through his hair. But why? Why only then? Holmes turned to him. That, Mr. Llewellyn, is precisely what we shall determine. What followed was one of the most meticulous examinations I have ever witnessed. Holmes began not with the portrait itself, but with the room as a whole. He measured the distance between the painting and the nearest window. He examined the curtains, the lamp, the fireplace, even the position of the furniture. Nothing escaped his scrutiny. Watson, he said at one point, the lamp. I brought it closer. He adjusted its angle, then observed the portrait again, first directly, then from the side, then by means of reflection in a nearby glass cabinet. Light, he murmured. Always light. What do you suspect? I asked. That the effect may not exist in the object alone, he replied, but in the interaction between object and observer. I frowned. You mean, it depends on how we see it? Possibly. At last, he turned his attention fully to the portrait. Mr. Llewellyn, he said, you will forgive me if I examine this more closely. By all means, the man replied, though I saw him wince slightly. Holmes removed his gloves and, with the utmost delicacy, ran his fingers along the frame. Solid, he said, no hidden mechanism. He then leaned in, examining the surface of the canvas itself. Curious, he murmured again. What is it? I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he withdrew a small lens from his pocket and studied the painted surface in silence. At length, he spoke. The pigment, he said. It is unusual. In what way? It reflects light differently, he replied. Subtly, but enough to be significant. He stepped back. Watson, look at her eyes. I did so, though not without discomfort. Well, Holmes prompted. They are remarkably lifelike, I said. Almost too much so. Precisely. He turned to Llewellyn. You mentioned that you believed they moved. Yes, the man said quickly. I am certain of it. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps, he said, they did. I stared at him. Holmes, you cannot seriously believe. I believe nothing, he interrupted. I merely consider possibilities. It was then that he noticed something which, I confess, had entirely escaped my attention. Watson, he said sharply, the signature. I looked to the lower corner of the painting. There, in fine script, was the artist's name. E. Varelli. Do you recognize it? Holmes asked. No, I admitted. Should I? Holmes's expression grew more intent. It is not widely known, he said. But I have encountered it once before. Where? In connection with a most curious case on the continent, he replied. A painter whose works were unconventional. In what sense? Holmes replaced his lens. In the sense, he said quietly, that they were said to produce effects upon the viewer. A chill ran through me. You mean, similar to this? Holmes did not answer directly. Mr. Llewellyn, he said instead, did the seller mention anything of the artist? Very little, he replied. Only that the painting was rare. And the previous owner, I was not told. Holmes's lips tightened slightly. How convenient. The hour had grown late, and Holmes at last declared that we had seen sufficient for the night. We shall return in the morning, he said. There are inquiries to be made. Llewellyn looked visibly relieved. You will not leave me alone with it? He asked anxiously. Holmes considered. Watson, he said, you will remain here tonight. Holmes, I exclaimed. My dear fellow, he said calmly, our client is in no condition to face this alone, and we require an observer. I hesitated, but only briefly. Very well, I said. Holmes nodded. Excellent. Make note of any changes, however slight. I shall return at first light. He turned to leave, then paused. One final thing, he added. Yes, I said. Do not look at it for too long. I felt an involuntary shiver. And why not? I asked. Holmes's gaze met mine. Because, he said quietly, I am no longer certain that it is entirely passive. With that, he departed, leaving me alone with Mr. Llewellyn and the portrait. The fire burned low. The room was silent. For a time, nothing occurred. Yet I found my eyes drawn again and again to the painting. The woman's face, her expression, those eyes. I tore my gaze away. Holmes's warning echoed in my mind. Do not look at it for too long. And yet, there was something in it. Something that compelled attention. Something that seemed to deepen the longer one observed. As the hours wore on, I began to feel a most peculiar sensation. Not fear, precisely, but a growing certainty that the boundary between observer and subject was not as fixed as I had always believed. And somewhere, deep within that uneasy thought, a far more troubling question began to take shape. What if the painting was not burning at all, but changing? It is no small trial of the nerves to spend a night in the company of a phenomenon one cannot explain. I have endured, in my association with Sherlock Holmes, circumstances of no ordinary peril, yet I confess that the quiet vigil I kept in Mr. Llewellyn's study that night ranks among the most unsettling. Holmes had departed shortly after midnight, leaving me with instructions as simple as they were disquieting. Observe, record, and above all, avoid prolonged scrutiny of the portrait itself. I resolved to obey him faithfully, though the execution of that resolve proved more difficult than I had anticipated. Mr. Llewellyn retired to an adjoining chamber, pleading exhaustion of both mind and body. I remained in the study, seated near the fire, with my notebook at hand. The portrait hung before me, its blackened edges stark against the lamplight, the woman's pale face emerging from the darkness with a clarity that seemed almost deliberate. For some time, nothing occurred. The house was still. The occasional creak of settling timbers, the distant rumble of carriage wheels beyond the walls, these were the only sounds that broke the silence. I recorded the time at regular intervals, noting the absence of further change. And yet, there persisted that peculiar sensation. A subtle discomfort, not fear, exactly, but an awareness, an impression that I was not merely observing, but somehow, engaged. Several times, I caught myself looking at the portrait longer than I intended. Each time, I forced my gaze away, recalling Holmes's warning. Do not look at it for too long. At approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, I became aware of a faint odor, the same which Mr. Llewellyn had described, smoke. I rose at once and approached the painting. There was no visible flame, no glow, and yet the scent was unmistakable. I examined the edges carefully. No change. The blackened border remained as it had been at midnight, no further advancement. I noted this with some confusion. Curious, I murmured to myself. If the burning occurred only at a fixed hour, then what accounted for the smell? I was still pondering this question when I became aware of something else. A sound, soft, almost imperceptible, a faint crackling, like the distant whisper of embers. I leaned closer. The sound ceased. I stepped back. Silence. It was at that moment that a most disagreeable thought entered my mind. Was the sound real, or had I imagined it? I confess that I did not linger to test the matter further. Holmes returned promptly at 8 o'clock the following morning, as composed and alert as though he had enjoyed a full night's rest, which, knowing him, was by no means certain. Well, Watson, he said, removing his gloves. Your observations. I recounted the events of the night in full, omitting nothing. Holmes listened with close attention, his eyes half closed. The smell of smoke outside the interval, he said thoughtfully. And a possible auditory component. Yes, I replied, though I cannot be certain of the latter. Holmes nodded. Uncertainty, my dear Watson, is often the first step toward clarity. Mr. Llewellyn joined us shortly thereafter, his appearance no less haggard than on the previous evening. Has it changed? He asked anxiously. No, I said. Not since midnight. He sank into a chair with visible relief. Thank heaven. Holmes, however, did not share his comfort. On the contrary, he said, I should be most interested if it had changed. Llewellyn stared at him. You mean, you wish it to worsen? I wish, Holmes replied calmly, to understand it. It was at this juncture that Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard made his entrance, unannounced. as was his habit, and with an air of brisk confidence that I have always found faintly amusing. "Ah, Mr. Holmes," he exclaimed, "I thought I might find you here." Holmes inclined his head. "Inspector." Lestrade cast a quick glance about the room before fixing his attention upon the portrait. "So this is the thing causing all the fuss," he said. "I must say, it looks ordinary enough." "Appearances," Holmes remarked, "are not always reliable." "No," Lestrade agreed dryly, "but they're a good deal more reliable than ghost stories." Mr. Llewellyn bristled. "I assure you, Inspector, there is nothing imaginary about what I have seen." Lestrade raised a placating hand. Quite, and I don't doubt you've seen something. The question is, what?" He turned to Holmes. "I've made a few inquiries," he said, "about this painting, and the fellow who sold it." Holmes's interest sharpened. "Indeed, yes. Name of Silas Breckenridge. Dealer of sorts. Not the most reputable, if you take my meaning." Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. "Where may he be found?" Lestrade smiled. "Already taken care of. I had him brought in this morning." Mr. Llewellyn leaned forward. "You mean, he's been arrested?" "For questioning," Lestrade corrected. "And I think you'll find he has a good deal to say." Within the hour, we were seated in a small interview room at Scotland Yard, where Mr. Silas Breckenridge was produced before us. He was a wiry man of middle age, with sharp features and an expression of habitual cunning. His eyes flicked from one face to another, lingering longest upon Holmes. Say precisely what it was, but I felt it at once. Attention, a presence, as though the house, though empty of life, was not entirely without influence. Holmes moved swiftly through the hallway, retracing our previous path to the main studio. From there, he paused, his eyes scanning the far wall. "The rear chamber," he said. "Breckenridge, you will show us." The dealer swallowed nervously. "This way," he said. We followed him down a narrow corridor, darker than the rest of the house, the air close and stale. At the far end stood a heavy wooden door. "This is it," Breckenridge said, his voice low. Holmes stepped forward and examined the lock. "Recently forced," he said. "Your work, I presume?" Breckenridge nodded. Holmes pushed the door open. What lay beyond was not a room in the ordinary sense, but something closer to a workshop, though unstripped of all but the most essential elements. The windows were shuttered, admitting only the faintest trace of light. A single lamp stood upon a table, unlit. The walls were bare, save for a few scattered sketches, each bearing those same strange, geometric patterns we had seen before. And at the center, an easel. Upon it, the unfinished work. I felt an involuntary tightening in my chest. It was, as Breckenridge had described, unlike the others. There was no portrait, no figure, only a structure, a form composed of intersecting lines and curves, subtle, intricate, and profoundly unsettling. It was not immediately intelligible. Indeed, the more one looked at it, the less certain one became of what one saw. "Good Lord," Lestrade muttered. "What is it?" Holmes stepped forward slowly. "The culmination," he said. I found it difficult to look at the canvas for more than a moment at a time. There was something about it, something deeply wrong. "Holmes," I said, "this is dangerous." "Yes," he replied quietly. "More so than the others." He turned to us. "Listen carefully. No one is to look directly at the center of the image for more than a few seconds. If you feel disoriented, look away at once." Lestrade gave a skeptical snort. "Very well," he said. "But I still say this is all." He stopped. His expression changed. "Holmes," he said slowly. "Yes, I don't like it." Holmes nodded. "Then do not look at it." He himself, however, did not look away. Instead, he began to circle the easel, studying the painting from different angles, just as he had done before. "Watson," he said, "observe from here." I moved to his side, careful to follow his instructions. From this angle, the structure seemed almost to resolve, almost to take on a form. Then it shifted, not physically, but perceptually. "Extraordinary," Holmes murmured. It was then that we heard it. A sound, faint, almost imperceptible, a whisper. I turned sharply. "Did you hear that?" Lestrade looked around. "Hear what?" Holmes held up a hand. Silence. We listened. There it was again, a low murmur, like the echo of a voice, distorted and distant. It's coming from the painting, Breckenridge whispered. Holmes's expression grew grave. No, he said, it is coming from beyond it. A chill ran through me. Holmes, what does that mean? Holmes did not answer. Instead, he stepped closer to the canvas. Mr. Hargreaves, he said quietly. The whisper ceased. A silence followed. Then, a faint, broken sound. Help. It was unmistakable. A voice. Weak, distant, yet real. Good heavens, I exclaimed. It is him. Lestrade stared in disbelief. That's impossible. Holmes's eyes never left the painting. No, he said softly. It is entirely possible. He turned to us. The man is not gone, he said. He is trapped. Trapped where? I demanded. Holmes gestured toward the canvas. Within the structure, he said. Lestrade shook his head violently. That's madness. Holmes's voice sharpened. Is it? Consider what we have established. That the mind may be guided, compelled, into a pattern. That perception defines reality for the observer. Yes. But, what if, Holmes continued, the mind, in attempting to resolve the final contradiction, does not collapse, but becomes contained within it? A silence fell. I felt my pulse quicken. You mean, he is alive, but his mind is caught? Precisely, Holmes said, and the voice, a residual expression, Holmes replied. A fragment of awareness. Another faint sound emerged. Help. We all heard it. Lestrade's face had gone pale. What do we do? He asked. Holmes's gaze was fixed, unwavering. We must break the pattern, he said. How? I asked. Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he studied the canvas with renewed intensity. The structure is incomplete, he said. That is our advantage. Incomplete, I repeated. Yes, Holmes said. The final resolution has not been fixed. It can still be disrupted. He turned sharply. Watson, your mirror. I handed it to him at once. Inspector, stand ready. Lestrade nodded. Holmes positioned himself before the painting, but this time, he did not look directly at it. Instead, he viewed it through the mirror. Reverse the perception, he murmured. Break the sequence. The whisper grew louder, more urgent. Help, please. Holmes, I cried. Hurry. I am aware, he said sharply. His hand moved, swift, precise. He seized a cloth from the nearby table and, without hesitation, cast it across the center of the canvas. At once, the whisper ceased. The room fell silent. A moment passed. Then, a sound behind us. A gasp. We turned. There, upon the floor near the far wall, lay a man, pale, disoriented, but alive. Mr. Hargreaves, I exclaimed, rushing to his side. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with confusion. Where? You are safe, I said. You are safe. Holmes stood very still, his gaze fixed upon the now covered canvas. It is done, he said quietly. Lestrade let out a long breath. I'll be damned, he muttered. As I assisted the recovered man to his feet, I could not help but glance once more at the shrouded painting. And though it was now concealed from view, I felt, with a certainty I cannot explain, that whatever power it had held, had not been entirely destroyed. It is one of the many paradoxes in the career of Sherlock Holmes that the moment of greatest clarity is often accompanied by a deepening sense of unease. For while the intellect may at last discern the pattern, the implications of that pattern, once fully understood, are not always comforting. Such was most certainly the case in the aftermath of our discovery in the Kensington house. Mr. Hargreaves, the unfortunate gentleman whom we had recovered from that dreadful perceptual prison, was conveyed at once to a place of safety, where I undertook to examine him more thoroughly. Though physically unharmed, his condition bore all the hallmarks of severe mental strain. His recollections were fragmentary, disjointed, and marked by a persistent inability to describe what he had experienced. I saw it, he repeated, again and again. I saw it, but it would not resolve. What would not resolve? I asked gently. The center, he said, his voice trembling. It kept changing. No, not changing, refusing to be anything at all. Holmes, who stood nearby, listened in silence. And then, he prompted. Hargreaves shook his head. I cannot say, he whispered. I tried to understand it, but the more I looked, the less there was to understand. It was as though the very act of seeing destroyed what I was seeing. Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. Yes, he said softly. Just so. Later that evening, we returned once more to Baker Street, bringing with us the final painting, now securely covered, and the accumulated evidence of the case. Inspector Lestrade was present, along with Mr. Llewellyn, who received the news of Hargreaves's survival with visible relief. "You have saved him," he said to Holmes. "Saved us all." Holmes waved the remark aside. "We have merely interrupted a process," he said. "Whether it may resume, is another matter." I could not suppress a slight shiver. "Holmes," I said, "surely now you will explain everything." He regarded me for a moment. "Yes," he said, "it is time." We gathered about the table. Holmes stood before us, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression composed yet intent. "Gentlemen," he began, "we have been confronted with a series of events which, at first glance, appear to defy explanation. A painting that burns without flame, men who perish without injury, and a third who vanishes, only to be recovered from a condition that may be described, without exaggeration, as imprisonment within perception itself." Lestrade shifted uneasily. "I'd settle for a simpler explanation, if you have one." Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile. "I shall endeavor to be as simple as the facts permit." He turned to the covered canvas. "At the heart of this matter lies the work of one E. Varelli, a painter whose interest extended beyond the merely aesthetic into the realm of cognition." "Meaning?" Lestrade asked. "Meaning," Holmes replied, "that he sought not merely to depict reality, but to manipulate the way in which it is perceived." He removed a sheet from the table, the diagram we had seen in the studio. "These designs," he continued, "are not decorative. They are functional. They guide the eye along specific paths, controlling the sequence in which visual information is processed." "And to what end?" I asked. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "To construct," he said, "a perception that cannot exist." A silence fell. "Cannot exist," Llewellyn repeated. Holmes nodded. "A paradox," he said. "A form which, when fully apprehended, presents mutually exclusive interpretations, each equally compelling, yet impossible to reconcile." Lestrade frowned. "You're saying the brain gets confused?" Holmes inclined his head. "In the simplest terms, yes." He began to pace slowly. "In the earlier works, the portraits, the effect is incomplete. The observer is guided toward the contradiction, but may withdraw before it is fully realized. This accounts for the progressive burning, a perceived manifestation of cognitive strain." "And the deaths?" I asked. Holmes stopped. "In certain individuals," he said, "the mind persists. It attempts, again and again, to resolve the contradiction. The resulting strain, intense, sustained, may lead to collapse." I felt a chill. "You mean, they thought themselves to death?" Holmes's voice was quiet. "In effect." Lestrade shook his head. "It's a wonder anyone survived at all." Holmes glanced at Llewellyn. "Mr. Llewellyn did," he said, because he looked away. Llewellyn shuddered. "I shall never forget that moment," he said. Holmes turned back to the covered canvas. "The final work," he said, "represents the culmination of Varelli's efforts. A complete structure, designed not merely to confuse, but to contain." "Contain whatever." A murmur passed through the room. "You mean, what happened to Hargreaves?" I said. "Precisely," Holmes replied. "His mind, unable to resolve the central paradox, became fixed within it, trapped in a loop of perception." "And his body?" Lestrade asked. "Unconscious," Holmes said, "or rather, disengaged." I felt a deep unease. "Holmes," I said, "why would any man create such a thing?" Holmes was silent for a moment. Then, "Because," he said, "he could." He resumed his pacing. "Varelli was not merely an artist," he continued. "He was an experimenter. He sought to explore the limits of perception, to determine how far the mind might be pushed before it breaks, or transforms." "Transforms," I repeated. Holmes turned to me. "Consider Mr. Hargreaves," he said. "Though he has recovered, his account suggests that, for a time, his perception was entirely governed by the structure of the painting." "You mean, his reality was replaced?" Holmes nodded. "Exactly." Lestrade gave a low whistle. "And if you hadn't pulled him out?" Holmes's expression grew grave. "He might never have returned." A silence followed. Then I asked the question which had been troubling me most. "Holmes, the burning, yes, if it is not real, if it is only perceived, Why does it follow the same pattern? Why does it progress? Holmes smiled faintly. An excellent question, Watson. He took up one of his sketches. The answer lies in expectation, he said. The mind, guided along a certain path, anticipates a result. When that result is delayed, or altered, the mind compensates, constructing a narrative of change. You mean, it imagines the burning. Not imagines, Holmes corrected. Experiences. He set down the sketch. In this case, the experience takes the form of gradual destruction, a visual metaphor for the increasing instability of perception. I considered this. And the voice? I asked. We heard Hargreaves speak. Holmes nodded. A residual expression of consciousness, he said. A fragment of awareness attempting to assert itself within the structure. Lestrade shook his head slowly. Well, he said, I'll say this for your Mr. Varelli. He had a mind on him. Holmes's expression hardened slightly. A dangerous one, he said. He moved to the covered painting. There remains, he said, only one question. And that is, I asked. Holmes placed a hand upon the cloth. What is to be done with this? A silence fell. Lestrade spoke first. Destroy it, he said firmly. Burn it, properly, this time. Llewellyn nodded. I agree. I looked to Holmes. And you? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he stood very still, his hand resting upon the covered canvas. At times, he said slowly, the line between knowledge and danger is exceedingly fine. He turned to us. This work represents a discovery, however misguided its application. Lestrade snorted. A discovery that kills people. Yes, Holmes said, and for that reason, it cannot be allowed to persist. He lifted the cloth slightly, just enough to glimpse the edge beneath. Then, he let it fall. It will be destroyed, he said. And yet, as I watched him, I could not help but notice something in his expression. Not doubt, not hesitation, but something far more subtle. A trace of curiosity. It is with some hesitation that I set down the final chapter of this singular case, for though its outward conclusion may appear decisive, there lingers about it a certain disquiet, a suggestion that the boundaries we had brushed against were not so firmly defined as one might wish to believe. The events which I now relate occurred on the evening following Holmes's declaration that the final painting must be destroyed. Our sitting room at Baker Street was, once again, arranged with deliberate care. The windows were shuttered, the lamps adjusted, and the canvas, still concealed beneath its heavy cloth, stood upon the easel like some veiled and waiting presence. Inspector Lestrade was present, resolute in his determination that the matter should be brought to a swift and permanent conclusion. Mr. Llewellyn, though visibly uneasy, had likewise insisted upon witnessing the destruction, as though only by seeing it done might he be freed from the lingering shadow of his ordeal. For my own part, I confess that I approached the moment with mixed feelings. The rational side of my nature welcomed the prospect of ending a danger so insidious and so difficult to define. Yet another part, less easily satisfied, felt that we were about to extinguish something not merely perilous, but profoundly significant. Holmes, as ever, betrayed no such conflict. He stood beside the easel, calm, composed, and entirely master of himself. Gentlemen, he said, we are agreed that the continued existence of this object constitutes a risk which cannot be justified. Lestrade nodded curtly. Quite agreed. Holmes inclined his head. Then we proceed. He turned to me. Watson, if you would be so good as to prepare the fire. I moved at once to the grate and, with some effort, coaxed the embers into a steady flame. The firelight flickered against the walls, casting shifting shadows that seemed, in that moment, peculiarly suggestive. It is ready, I said. Holmes acknowledged this with a slight gesture. Then, with deliberate care, he approached the easel. Before we act, he said, there is one final point to be made. Lestrade sighed. Must there always be a speech, Holmes? Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile. In matters such as these, he said, clarity is not a luxury, but a necessity. He rested his hand upon the cloth. What we have encountered, he continued, is not a supernatural phenomenon, nor a trick of mere artistry, but a deliberate and highly sophisticated manipulation of human perception. He looked at each of us in turn. Varelli's work demonstrates that the mind, when presented with a sufficiently complex and carefully structured contradiction, may be driven to extremes which we are only beginning to understand. And now we're going to burn it, Lestrade said. Holmes nodded. Yes. He paused. Then, with a swift and decisive motion, he removed the cloth. For a brief instant, no more, we all saw it. The structure. The impossible convergence of lines and forms. The center. I tore my gaze away at once, my heart pounding violently in my chest. Holmes, I cried. But Holmes had already acted. With a single, fluid movement, he seized the canvas from the easel and carried it to the fire. Now, Lestrade shouted. Holmes did not hesitate. He thrust the painting into the flames. What followed was unlike anything I have ever witnessed. For though the fire took hold at once, consuming the edges with a rapid, eager intensity, the effect was not merely one of burning. It was as though the image itself resisted. The lines seemed to shift, to writhe, though I knew, even as I saw it, that this could not be so. A strange sensation overtook me, an impression that the room itself had tilted, that the very air had thickened. Do not look, Holmes's voice rang out sharply. I turned away, fixing my gaze upon the far wall. Behind me, the fire crackled fiercely. There came a sound, not of flame, not of wood, but something else, a faint, discordant murmur, like the echo of a thought that could not quite form. Then, silence. Watson, Holmes said. I turned back. The canvas was gone, only ashes remained. Lestrade let out a long breath. Well, he said, that's that. Holmes stood very still, his eyes fixed upon the dying embers. Yes, he said quietly. That is that, Mr. Llewellyn approached cautiously. It is finished, he asked. Holmes turned to him. It is finished, he said. And yet, as I watched him, I could not help but notice that his gaze lingered, just for a moment longer than seemed necessary, upon the ashes. The following days saw a gradual return to normality. Mr. Hargreaves recovered steadily, though he retained no clear memory of his ordeal. Mr. Llewellyn disposed of the remaining works in his collection, and Inspector Lestrade, for his part, was content to record the matter as one of those rare and inexplicable cases which, though resolved, defy easy classification. As for myself, I endeavored to set the events in order, committing them to paper with as much fidelity as memory would allow. Holmes, meanwhile, resumed his usual pursuits with apparent indifference. Yet I could not entirely dismiss the impression that the case had left its mark upon him. One evening, some weeks later, I found him seated by the window, his violin resting idle across his knees. You were thinking of Varelli, I said. Holmes did not look up. I am thinking, he replied, of the implications. For good, or ill? I asked. Holmes's lips curved slightly. That, he said, depends upon the observer. I joined him at the window. The paintings are gone, I said. The danger has passed. Holmes turned to me then, his eyes keen. Has it? He asked. I hesitated. You believe otherwise. Holmes rose and crossed to the table. From among his papers, he drew forth a small object. During our final visit to the studio, he said, I observed a fragment, no larger than a coin, detached from one of the earlier works. He held it up. I retained it. I felt a sudden unease. Holmes, it is harmless, he said. In isolation, he placed it upon the table. But it suggests something important. And that is, Holmes's gaze was steady, that the principle, once discovered, cannot be undiscovered. A silence fell. You mean, others could replicate it? Holmes inclined his head. Given sufficient knowledge and inclination, yes. I felt a chill. Then we have not ended it at all. Holmes gave a faint smile. We have ended this instance, he said. For the rest, he shrugged lightly. The future must decide. He returned to his chair and took up his violin. A moment later, the room was filled with music, soft, contemplative, and tinged with something I had rarely heard in his playing. Not triumph, not even satisfaction, but something closer to reflection. And so I bring this account to its close. Whether the strange art of E. Varelli shall ever again trouble the world, I cannot say. I can only record that, for a brief and unsettling period, we stood face to face with a phenomenon that challenged not merely our understanding of crime, but of perception itself. And if there is a lesson to be drawn from it, perhaps it is this: that the greatest mysteries are not always those which lie hidden in the world, but those which remained uncharacteristically silent upon our return from Kensington. Though he spent the afternoon in our sitting room, his attention appeared divided between the scattered notes he had brought from Varelli's studio and the charred fragment which still lay upon the table. He neither explained his thoughts nor invited inquiry, a sure sign, as I have observed, that his mind was engaged upon some delicate and intricate problem. For my own part, I endeavored to bring order to the facts as we knew them. A painter, Varelli, whose works influenced perception. A portrait that exhibited a progressive, burning, without heat. A pattern of visual distortion dependent upon angle and light. And now, those curious diagrams suggesting that the eye itself might be guided, perhaps even deceived, into perceiving what was not truly there. I had just begun to arrange these elements in my notes when the stillness of the room was abruptly shattered by a hurried knock upon the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, her expression tinged with alarm. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "there's a gentleman below, says it's urgent. Something about another painting." Holmes was on his feet at once. "Show him up." A moment later, Inspector Lestrade burst into the room, his usual composure replaced by something approaching agitation. "Holmes," he said, "we've another one." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Explain." Lestrade removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair. "A house in Bloomsbury," he said. "Collector. Name of Mr. Daniel Harrow. Found this morning in his study. Dead." I felt a chill. "Dead," I repeated. "Under what circumstances?" Lestrade hesitated. "That's just it," he said. "There's no sign of struggle. No wound. No poison that we can detect." But, Holmes prompted. "There's a painting," Lestrade said grimly. "And it looks very much like the one you described." Holmes's expression hardened instantly. "Then we go there at once." Within half an hour, we stood in the study of the late Mr. Daniel Harrow. The scene bore a striking resemblance to that of Mr. Llewellyn's residence. Rich furnishings, walls adorned with art, a central fireplace still smoldering faintly. But it was not the room itself that commanded attention. It was the body. Mr. Harrow sat slumped in a high-backed chair, his head tilted slightly to one side, his features frozen in an expression that I can only describe as one of profound bewilderment. His eyes were open, wide, unseeing. And before him hung the portrait. Another woman, another dark attire, another blackened edge creeping inward from the frame. "Good God," I murmured. Holmes moved forward without hesitation. "Time of death?" he asked. "Somewhere between midnight and 1, Lestrade replied. "Servant found him this morning." Holmes nodded. "Very good." He turned to the body. "Watson." I stepped forward and conducted a brief examination. "No external injury," I said. "No sign of violence. The expression suggests sudden shock, or perhaps extreme mental distress." Holmes's gaze flicked toward the painting. "Indeed. Now," he said quietly, "we must determine what he saw." Lestrade frowned. "He saw a painting," he said, "and died of fright, if you ask me." Holmes did not respond. Instead, he approached the portrait with the same careful precision he had exhibited at Mr. Llewellyn's residence. "Observe the pattern," he said. I did so. The blackened border was more advanced than before, further encroaching upon the image, though still leaving the central figure untouched. "It has progressed further," I said. "Precisely," Holmes replied, "which suggests that this process is not unique to a single canvas." Lestrade crossed his arms. "So there's more than one of these things," he said. "All the more reason to destroy them." Holmes turned sharply. "No." Lestrade blinked. "No. To destroy them now," Holmes said, "would be to destroy the very evidence we require." "Evidence of what?" Lestrade demanded. Holmes did not answer directly. "Watson," he said instead, "your mirror." I handed it to him at once. As before, he positioned it so that the portrait was visible only in reflection. "Now look," he said. I did, and once again, the effect was unmistakable. The pattern shifted, subtly, but undeniably. "It is not fixed," I said. "It depends on the angle." Holmes nodded. "And therefore, on the observer." Lestrade looked unimpressed. "Trick painting," he muttered. "Nothing more." Holmes's eyes remained upon the image. "Tell me, Inspector," he said, "did Mr. Harrow have any connection to Mr. Llewellyn?" Lestrade shrugged. "Both collectors. That's about it." Holmes turned. "And both acquired paintings of the same artist." Lestrade's expression shifted slightly. "You think that's coincidence?" Holmes's voice was quiet. "I think," he said, "that we are dealing with a series." It was at that moment that a servant entered, pale and visibly shaken. "Begging your pardon, sir," he said to Lestrade, "but there's something else." "What is it?" Lestrade snapped. "The study door," the man said. "It was locked, from the inside." A silence fell. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "A locked room," he murmured. "How very instructive." Lestrade frowned. "You don't think—" "I think," Holmes said, "that Mr. Harrow was alone when he died." "Then what killed him?" I asked. Holmes turned slowly toward the portrait. "That," he said, as the question. I felt a growing unease as I looked upon the painted figure. There was something in her expression, something I had not noticed before. A subtle difference, a suggestion, almost, of awareness. "Holmes," I said quietly, "do you believe the painting itself could?" "No," he said sharply. I started. "No," I repeated. Holmes's gaze softened slightly. "No, Watson," he said. "The painting does nothing." "Then how do you explain this?" Holmes's expression grew grave. "It is not the painting," he said. "It is what the painting causes." Lestrade snorted. "You're talking in riddles again." Holmes ignored him. "Consider," he said, "that both victims were alone. That both observed the painting at the same hour. And that both experienced a phenomenon which we have already witnessed, though in a far less severe form." "You mean the burning?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "No," he said. "Something else." He paused. "Something far more dangerous." We remained in that room for some time, examining every detail, yet no further clue presented itself. At last, Holmes declared that we had seen sufficient. "We must return to Baker Street," he said. "There are matters to consider." Lestrade looked dissatisfied. "You're not going to tell me what you think?" Holmes gave a faint smile. "My dear Inspector," he said, "if I told you now, you would not believe me." As we stepped once more into the cold London air, I turned to Holmes at once. "Well," I said, "what is it that you are not telling me?" Holmes walked on in silence for several paces. Then, "Watson," he said, "have you ever considered the possibility that a man might be killed, not by what he touches, but by what he sees?" I felt a sudden chill. "You cannot mean—" "I mean," Holmes said quietly, "that we are no longer dealing with a simple deception." He stopped. "And if I am correct?" "Yes," I urged. Holmes's gaze was distant. "Then the danger lies not in the canvas." He turned to me, but in the mind of the observer. A silence fell between us as we continued our journey. And though I did not yet understand the full implications of his words, I could not escape the growing conviction that we stood upon the edge of something far more perilous than we had first imagined. For if Holmes was right, then the true weapon in this case was not paint, nor fire, nor any physical instrument, but perception itself. I have often observed that when Sherlock Holmes approaches the threshold of a great deduction, his manner undergoes a subtle but unmistakable transformation. The languor vanishes, the violin is set aside, and even his customary irony gives way to a colder, sharper intensity. It is as though the very machinery of his mind shifts into a higher gear, one in which every detail, however small, assumes a precise and deliberate significance. Such was his state upon our return to Baker Street following the death of Mr. Harrow. He spoke little during the journey, and when we entered our sitting room, he at once cleared the central table and began arranging the various materials we had collected. The charred fragment, his notes from Borelli's studio, and several rough sketches which he now drew with rapid, decisive strokes. "Watson," he said at last, "I require your assistance." "You have it," I replied. "Good. Then attend closely." He placed before me two sketches, each representing the outline of a portrait, with the familiar encroaching blackened edge. "Observe these patterns," he said. "One from Mr. Llewellyn's painting, the other from Mr. Harrow's." I studied them carefully. "They are similar," I said, "but not identical." "Precisely," Holmes replied, "and yet the progression follows a consistent principle." He took up a pencil and drew a series of lines connecting the two. "Each begins at the edge," he continued, "and advances inward in a manner that is neither random nor symmetrical, but guided." "Guided by what?" I asked. Holmes looked at me. "By the structure of the image itself." I frowned. "You mean the subject of the portrait?" "In part," he said. "But more importantly, the arrangement of lines, shadows, and contrasts." The very elements that direct the eye. He rose and crossed to the window, drawing the curtains slightly to admit a different quality of light. "Come here," he said. I joined him. Holmes held one of his sketches at an angle. "Now," he said, "follow the lines." I did so, tracing the path with my eyes. It was an odd sensation. The gaze seemed to move of its own accord, drawn along certain curves, guided by the interplay of light and dark. "You see it?" Holmes asked. "Yes," I said slowly. "It is as though the image is directing where one looks." "Exactly." He turned back to the table. "And if one can direct the eye," he continued, "one may also influence the mind." I felt a growing unease. "You believe that these paintings are designed to affect the observer?" Holmes nodded. "Not merely to affect, but to control perception." "To what end?" Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he resumed his pacing, a sure sign that his thoughts were moving rapidly. "Consider the sequence," he said. "The observer gazes upon the portrait. The eye is guided along a predetermined path. The mind, in attempting to interpret what it sees, is led into a pattern, one which does not correspond to reality." "A kind of illusion," I said. "Yes, but more than that." He stopped. "A conflict, I repeated. "Between what the eye perceives and what the mind expects," Holmes said. "And when that conflict reaches a certain threshold." He did not finish the sentence. "You believe it could kill?" I asked. Holmes's expression was grave. "I believe," he said, "that it could overwhelm the mind entirely." At that moment, Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. "For you, Mr. Holmes," she said. Holmes took it, glanced at the contents, and frowned slightly. "From Lestrade," he said. "Another development." "What is it?" I asked. Holmes handed me the telegram. I read, "Third, painting discovered, owner missing, house disturbed, request immediate assistance." I looked up. "A third," I said. Holmes's eyes were already